the dominant narratives, whether it is about Sri Lanka or what is happening elsewhere in the world, is really not being contested enough. And to engage in meaningful dialogue towards a way forward, whether it is in Sri Lanka or elsewhere. So the mainstream perspective, both in the media and academia, on Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan crisis is very limited, and I'm going to present very briefly what it is. It goes as this. The crisis in 2022 was due to a foreign exchange shortage in the country, and which in turn was largely due to corruption and mismanagement of the then Rajapaksa regime that was in power, as well as China's debt trap diplomacy. And the foreign exchange crisis in turn led to difficulties of importing essentials, food, fuel, medicines, and so on, and led to massive power cuts, long queues to collect essentials, and the suffering of the population resulted in a popular uprising against the regime, and both the Prime Minister and the President had to resign, and a new leader was appointed, which led to an acceptance of an IMF bailout, and the food and fuel started coming in, and the IMF restructuring process started, and now there's economic recovery, and things are moving in the right direction. So this is the mainstream narrative, which is propagated by the IMF, the Sri Lankan government, Western governments, the media, and many NGOs as well. So you have a map of Sri Lanka. You know, I have taken a few slides from the book to share with you. So obviously this is a very limited approach, and it leaves out a historical analysis, a geopolitical context, which is what I try to provide in the book. And I can't go into all the details here because I do want to leave room for discussion, so I'll give you a snapshot. So mainly the book approaches debt, which is at the center of the crisis, not as some kind of a neutral, straightforward number, but as an outcome of unequal power relations, an expression of colonialism and neocolonialism, which I spell out in the book. Now, getting into the historical background, Sri Lanka has had the longest historical experience of colonialism of any country in Asia, starting with the Portuguese in 1505, followed by the Dutch and then the British, who conquered the whole island in 1815. And there are some parallels of the conquest of Sri Lanka with the 1815 treaty and the 1840 treaty here with the Maoris. I'm just learning about that now. I'm no expert on that, so I won't go into details, but maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well at the end. So to understand the current problems with foreign exchange shortages and difficulty of importing essentials, it's necessary to understand the kind of economic model that was imposed on Sri Lanka, as in many other colonies around the world. So Sri Lanka was integrated into the global capitalist economy as an exporter of primary goods and resources that was necessary for industrializing Britain, the metropolitan country. And theories of comparative advantage, the ideologies of progress, development, and modernization were used to enforce this new economic system, which was about exports and imports, export of primary goods and natural resources, and import of essential food and commodities necessary for survival. So this is necessary in order to understand the current crisis. And so local economies, which had been relatively self-sufficient prior to the colonial experience, were now beginning to import food, and so on. And from the beginning, this system was one of unequal exchange. That was disadvantageous to the colonies because the terms of trade were set by the colonial powers. So the natural resources and labor of the colonized countries were undervalued, whereas the goods produced in the industrialized imperialist countries were overvalued. And this system of unequal exchange has essentially continued, taking new forms and shapes in the contemporary era. So to give you one example, the value transfer is actually from the global south to the global north and not the other way around as it is often assumed. Between 1980 and 2017, developing countries paid out 42 trillion solely in interest payments, which was way more than what was sent to those countries in the form of development aid. Let me see if I can just get some figures. Here, this is one table on the value transfer from global south to global north. I discussed this in the book. And today, it is not just Sri Lanka, but some 60 or more countries are, especially in the global south, are in debt crisis or near debt crisis. And as Debt Justice, which is an organization studying this phenomenon, point out, these debt crises are not simply a result of local corruption and mismanagement, which of course those are very important factors, but more due to the historical trajectory of colonialism and the kind of financial architecture at the global level that is set in place, which traps these countries into this debt cycle. So this is a map of countries in debt crisis taken from Debt Justice. So just to give a background, the high food prices are due not so much to supply and demand, but price speculation in highly financialized commodity markets. A handful of the largest asset management companies, especially BlackRock and Vanguard, control very large shares of companies in all major sectors of production in the world, from food and agribusiness to pharmaceuticals to defense to media, so on and so forth. So the dominance of finance capital in the global economy has expanded exponentially with corporate deregulation and the imposition of neoliberal policies around the world. Again, I discussed this at length in the book. And in the case of Sri Lanka, what is really behind the current debt crisis is the borrowing, commercial borrowing, especially of international sovereign bonds, which are referred to as ISBs, which carry very high interest rates. And BlackRock is the biggest ISB creditor for Sri Lanka. And it is interesting and important to note that 81% of the current debt held by Sri Lanka is actually held by creditors that are from the West and their allies and not China, as it is often thought. So the global financial institutions, notably IMF and the World Bank, still remain outside political and legal control without even elementary accountability. And this is really important to understand in terms of a country like Sri Lanka, being part of an IMF restructuring process. Another aspect to remember, and I don't have time to go into it at great detail, is with the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of fewer and fewer corporations, there's also increasing economic inequality with concentration of financial and political power in the hands of a small corporate elite. According to Oxfam, for example, the 1% at at the very top now control more wealth than the rest of the 99% of the world's population put together. So Sri Lanka has accepted a 2.9 billion bailout loan from the IMF, which is actually quite small compared to the total debt of 50 billion or so over a 45-month period. But at heavy cost, the conditions are very stringent. The conditions laid out by IMF for getting this loan. It calls for increases in state revenues, cutback in state expenses. And under the IMF diktat, there's been massive increases in electricity, water, and other tariffs on the general population in order to increase state revenues. There's been a value-added tax, or a VAT, of 18% on all manner of goods, including essentials. And this is borne heavily by the poorer segments of the population. And due to the inability to pay these increased electricity tariffs, over 1 million people in the country have lost access to electricity just in the past few months. Hundreds of small and medium enterprises have had to close down, partly due to the lack of power, difficulty of obtaining electricity. Also due to cutbacks in state subsidies and fertilizer, agricultural production is experiencing massive setbacks. And one thing that is happening on a very large scale is, in the name of increasing state revenue, and also in the name of curtailing inefficiency and corruption, state-owned enterprises, SOEs, are being privatized left and right. And this is a very large business in the world, the privatization industry, which is happening not just in Sri Lanka but around the world, and I'm not going into details here. The Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, the Ceylon Electricity Board, maritime ports, airports are all being privatized. And these represent threats not just to economic autonomy, but also to national security and sovereignty. And of course, the livelihoods of thousands of people. Because when the control of the electricity, the power grid, and goes into the and ports and airports go into the hands of external interests, the country loses its ability to make sovereign decisions. And cutbacks in social expenditure have been massive in the health and education sectors, which were renowned for its provision of services to the average population, and I'll go into more details about that later. And in some parts of the country, children are not going to school, they don't have the electricity to study for their exams at night. Malnutrition is increasing, and the World Bank itself has said that now about 28% of the population is below the poverty line. And economic disparities are increasing. Even in 2020, the top 1% of the population controlled over 31% of personal income and wealth, whereas the bottom 50% had access to less than 4%. And these divisions are further increasing now, with increased poverty and so on. And since the crisis, this has just been, over a year ago, over 1 million people, mostly young professionals, have left the country. The country is experiencing a brain drain like it's never seen before. And many more are seeking to go. Every third person you talk to, especially young people, is in the process of going abroad, and I'm sure many have come here to New Zealand as well. So there's a breakdown of the economy and the society. Now, Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF 16 times prior to this one. So it's not the first time, 16 times since political independence in 1948. And what it shows is that the objective of the IMF and the Bretton Woods institutions is not to extricate these countries from the cycle of debt, but to keep them trapped in the same model of export production and import of essential goods and continued borrowing from capital markets. When you read the IMF documents, you see that one of the main objectives for them is to get the country to be solvent so they can keep borrowing from capital markets, essentially ISVs, which cause the problem to begin with. So what I show in the book is that the Sri Lankan story is not just about economic subordination of the country, but it is also about victimization due to geopolitical rivalry over Sri Lanka. Now, given its strategic position in the heart of the Indian Ocean, in the east-west maritime trade routes, Sri Lanka has long been subjected to external political intervention and rivalry. And I discuss, how the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and even the French were all fighting over the Trincomalee Harbor, which is a natural harbor of great strategic value on the eastern sea coast of Sri Lanka. Yeah, this is the income disparity. Yeah, this is, so in current period, Sri Lanka has been caught in the struggle between China on the one side and the US and India on the other. Sri Lanka, like many other countries, is party to the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative of China. The Hambantota port is under Chinese control, as well as the Colombo port city, a terminal in the Colombo port, and many other infrastructural projects. So this is the China Belt Road, and these are Chinese ports around the world, and Hambantota in Sri Lanka being one important one. So the US and its allies launched the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy to curb Chinese expansion in the Indian Ocean, starting in 2007, making Sri Lanka the center of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Quad alliance, the quadrilateral alliance constituting the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, that is trying to curb Chinese expansion in the Indian Ocean region. So there is evidence that the 2022 April default and the foreign exchange crisis itself was staged to move Sri Lanka away from Chinese influence to make it more, to bring it under the West, the US credit lines and Indian credit lines. Sri Lanka actually, when you study the history, Sri Lanka did not have to declare default in April 2022 because it had access to bilateral loans, including from China at that time. But Sri Lanka was compelled to do so for political reasons. Again, the debt and economic crisis has to be seen in relation to power dynamics, and in this case, geopolitical rivalry over Sri Lanka. And so what happened was, following a popular protest movement, which came to be manipulated by various other self-interested parties, there was a regime change. The Rajapaksas were removed, and a leader who is much more an ally of the West and the US was put in place. And interestingly, this individual and his party was rejected by the electorate in the previous elections, in the presidential and the parliamentary elections. But nevertheless, sort of in violation of democratic principles, they were brought into power. And making use of that, the new regime has introduced all manner of policies that is to the advantage of the West and the Quadrilateral Alliance. So the external crisis paved the way for change in power dynamics, and since then India and the USA have aggressively asserted themselves on the island, both economically, politically, and militarily. So India provided loans to Sri Lanka at a critical time when Sri Lanka was struggling with meeting basic needs for fuel and food and so on. But in return, it has leveraged its influence to maximum advantage to financially, economically, politically, and even culturally dominate Sri Lanka. There have been a number of pacts signed by the new regime with India secretively without discussion in the parliament. Indian imports and soared, and dependence on India has increased. UPI, which is a Unified Payments Interface, has been introduced to Sri Lanka in order to further Indian rupee transactions. Now, some may see this as an alternative to dollar-denominated transactions, which has some value, but it has brought Sri Lanka within the control of India. Then there are discussion of a bilateral trade treaty called EFTA that would be favorable to India, and even bridging building a physical bridge, physically connecting India and Sri Lanka. Also, Indian companies are playing an increased role in Sri Lanka. Indian companies have been given access to creating a petroleum power line, linking Sri Lanka with India's power grid, the control of a wind turbine project in Mannar, the control of airports. The west terminal of the Colombo port is being given to the controversial Adani Group. Already Trincomalee is port, and the oil tank farms are under India. So again, this raises some interesting questions about BRICS. Is that really an alternative? Are they following a different model vis-a-vis smaller countries, or is it the same paradigm of domination and power? It should lead to a discussion of is BRICS an alternative to the unipolar US-dominated global system. So moving on to the USA, the US had tried to introduce something called a Millennium Challenge Cooperation Pact, which was both a development and security arrangement. It was not signed because of popular resistance, but its strategic goals are being carried out, especially by the new regime. And I will simply mention some of the important aspects of this, which is privatization of state land, because 80% of the land on the island is still owned by the government, which has leased them out to small farmers. And now they're trying to give farmers deeds, ownership rights, which could lead to them having to sell this land, which would again fall into the hands of private interests, including external interests. So in addition to privatization of land, there are two military pacts with the United States. One signed in 2017 called AXA, Acquisition and Cross-Service Agreement. And the objective of this is to make Sri Lanka the main supply hub for US armed forces in the Indo-Pacific region, and also to make Sri Lanka a US military logistics hub. Then there's SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement, essentially would make Sri Lanka a US-controlled military base, allowing free access to US military personnel to come in and out of the country, carry arms in uniform, etc. Both these pacts were really sort of signed in secrecy, and it's not even clear if the second was really signed, because the government, not just this current regime, but the previous regimes have not been forthcoming, but it is believed they've been signed. And it's interesting to note that the current US ambassador to Sri Lanka, Julie Chung's recent statement about future plans for using Sri Lanka as a logistics and military hub for the United States. And you have to consider this given the fact that the US is about to lose Diego Garcia as a military base because of conflicts over the ownership of Diego Garcia with Mauritius. So essentially, Julie Chung is saying that Sri Lanka is going to be a hub, US military hub, not only for control of the Indian Ocean, but even beyond that. And already several former Coastal Guard cutters from the US has been given to Sri Lanka, and one of them was actually deployed in the Red Sea to deter Houthi rebels who have been trying to block maritime traffic in the Red Sea in support of the Palestinian struggle. So you see already that there's an attempt to make Sri Lanka a part of this US strategy. I have quite a few things. Okay, so and on top of all that is happening economically and politically, there's also repression, curtailment of media, and worker resistance, any kind of resistance to this major restructuring that is going on in the island. So Sri Lanka, although it is an island, it is not an island unto itself. Like many other places in the world, it has been populated by immigrants over centuries, has had a relatively self-sufficient economy, and has political sovereignty. And in spite of all the external influences, it had maintained a specific island-based cultural identity. And the pre-colonial history was, of course, characterized by invasions from South Asia, especially India. And in the colonial period, there was resistance against the plantation economy, British colonial taxation policies, land policies, religious and educational policies. I've discussed some of these in my book, my first book, Colonialism in Sri Lanka, as well as the separate conflict in Sri Lanka. Now, in the period of decolonization, following political independence in 1948, in the 1950s and 1970s, there was a turn towards economic nationalism. And given electoral democracy, there was an attempt to raise the standards of living of the average people through provision of state social welfare. Now, here you see the physical quality of life indices, and Sri Lanka had higher standards of living at the time in the 1970s, even more so than China or India. It was in that sense, in terms of physical quality of life, not economic indices of GNP, but in terms of PQLI, physical quality of life indices, it was perhaps the richest country in South Asia, and very high standards of literacy, low infant mortality, high life expectancy, etc. And this was, partly due to the functioning of electoral democracy as well as nationalism and left-wing politics. Now, in the period of decolonization, there were attempts to create economic self-sufficiency and autonomy through nationalization of foreign-owned companies and import substitution efforts, and the establishment of a wide array of state-owned enterprises. I won't go into the details now, but I can talk about it later. And Sri Lanka was not alone in this. This was part of a wave of economic, political, and cultural nationalism around the world, particularly in third world countries. And it was part of the attempt to create a new international economic order. And the NIEO was championed by United Nations entities like UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which was demanding improved terms of trade for the third world. And Sri Lanka, though small, was a champion in this struggle. A Sri Lankan economist, Gamini Korea, was director of UNCTAD at one time. Sri Lanka was also a leader of the NAM, the new non-aligned movement, calling for the right of country to stay clear of the Cold War at that time between the US and Russia, Soviet Union. And Sirimavo Bandaranaike, the prime minister at that time, who was incidentally the first woman prime minister in the modern world, was a champion of both the NIEO and the NAM, the non-aligned movement, calling for self-determination, economic nationalism, and challenging the Bretton Woods free trade, export-oriented growth model, which are highly relevant today, both to Sri Lanka's crisis, looking in terms of alternatives. And and I have these as appendices in my book, the Declaration on the New International Economic Order, as well as the Declaration of the Indian Ocean as a Zone of Peace, which was adopted at the United Nations in 1971. Again, Sri Lanka and Mrs. Bandaranaike were champions of this. And this declaration of the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace is more relevant today than ever, given the new superpowers' rivalry over Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean. And so just to wrap up, Sri Lanka is poverty-stricken and desperate today, but it is a country with abundant natural resources and a resilient population with a history of highly complex hydraulic civilization and a Buddhist culture that preserve the environment and the teachings. And even in more recent times, the resistance has not just been in the past against colonialism and in the decolonization period, with a government-sponsored support for new international economic order, economic nationalism, and a zone of peace in the Indian Ocean. But even in more recent times, there have been a lot of resistance against the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Cooperation Pact, the AXA, the SOFA agreements with the United States, Indian control of the Trincomalee Harbor, as well as Chinese control of the Hambantota port, the port city, particularly on environmental grounds. So that there's been a history and trajectory of resistance against external control, which has continued. And in fact, in 2019-2020 period, when the Rajapaksas were brought back to power, one of the reasons for the popular mandate they received was the fear of increased international intervention that brought them to power. But once they were brought into power, their policies continued to be the same as the previous regimes. They did not necessarily uphold the nationalist mandate that brought them into power. So, So I'd like to conclude before I open things up for questions and discussion is that the crisis and the struggle in Sri Lanka is not of Sri Lanka's alone. It is part of global crises and struggles across the world. It is part of an ongoing existential struggle for people and the planet, for the right to political and economic and cultural sovereignty and self-determination, and also protection of the environment. And I haven't gone into details at all over the environmental destruction that is going on, especially with the coming of the dangers that lie ahead with the coming of a company like Adani, which is sort of known for environmental destructive policies around the world. But people are waking up to the destructive nature of the dominant technological and capitalist paradigm and the need for a fundamental change towards a partnership and ecological paradigm. And that's a whole other talk in itself, so I'm not going to into a discussion of that. But just wrap up by saying that the hope lies in human compassion and wisdom prevailing over greed, myopia, and fear, which seem to be dominant, but at the same time, there's also increasing concern and waking up on the part of people both in Sri Lanka and the world. And I believe that we each have a role to play in this process. So I will end my remarks now, and I'll be happy to take up questions and comments.
Thank you very much. It was really eye-opening. And I'm reminded once more of Patrick White's insight that colonialism isn't an event, it is a process. It's structural. This is very clear. So we'll open the floor to questions. We've got just over here.
Thank you so much, Professor Soka. I'm really honored to see another Sri Lankan eminent professor here in my host university. So being a Sri Lankan, at the same time, I'm really sad to hear what is going on in my country at the moment and all the hardships that people are going through at the moment. So I basically have two questions. One is you talked about how the external factors impact on the current crisis that Sri Lanka is facing. So if we move further and look into the local dynamics, don't you think that the local dynamics too have some sort of role to play, at least to come out from this crisis? And my second question is, if we think that, okay, the colonial history and the Western institutionalism and the financial institutions, these all things together put Sri Lanka and other southern countries into this crisis, then can we believe China is a better alternative? So how can we look into these two questions?
Thank you very much. Those are very good questions. I completely agree. I mean, I have focused on the external factors, but I don't see the external and the internal as being entirely separate. Because from the very beginning, colonialism could not have been possible without the collusion with local elites, political and economic elites, and they were an essential part of colonization, not only of classical colonialism, but of current neocolonialism. And that's a subject of its own, how it operates, especially through NGOs and various financial and other interests. So Sri Lanka, especially being a small country, is very much under the influence of a number of competing external powers. And the local political process is not entirely separate. And you see that especially with increased Indian involvement in domestic issues, not just of sort of economic control, but even in governance issues. So it's difficult to completely extricate the two. And one of the reasons is also that the population is divided along ethno-religious political party lines. And that kind of divide and conquer strategy was a classic strategy of colonialism and continues to be so under neocolonialism. So yes, but the dominant narrative tends to put the blame all on local factors, especially the Rajapaksa regime and corruption and inefficiency, mismanagement, all of which do exist, but they don't exist apart from international intervention. You know, there is a sort of working together. If you look at, for example, the bond scam that happened in 2015, that happened under the watchful eyes of the IMF. The IMF was right there. So it's hard to say, you know, what is local and what is international. They are very much intermeshed because of interest groups that are involved. And in terms of China, yes, in Sri Lanka there is a tendency on the part of many people to see Chinese intervention as more benevolent, that they don't necessarily interfere in local governance and politics like, say, the West and India would. But I think it's important to take a principled stance on sovereignty and independence and not fall into either camp, you know, which is what is happening now. Because many people who are critical of the Quad Alliance and Indian and US intervention would see no alternative but Chinese support. But I think it's important to really uphold the principles of non-alignment, not just in Sri Lanka, but globally, as a new power struggle is emerging.
I was going to ask a question. There's a book that came out after the global financial crisis that referred to the Bretton Woods system that you're referring to as sort of a global minotaur. And my question was that to what extent do you think that the dollar-denominated system that dominates the world sort of is responsible for the global north-south divide that we sort of see today?
Yeah, it's very much so. You know, the dollar-denominated system, the Bretton Woods system, you know, it's all part of the global financial architecture that needs to be changed, you know, which has been favorable to the West and the dominant institutions. But we also have to question if the emergence of what are being called sub-big imperialist powers like China or even BRICS is necessarily an alternative, especially for countries like Sri Lanka. Although it's clear that, you know, there's got to be changes in the existing system, but also in what direction should the change go? Because if you look at even China, you know, although they are rivals, they are still pursuing the same model of excessive technological and profit-led growth model. They are still functioning within that same paradigm. Whereas people who are really talking about alternatives, an ecological paradigm, are talking about more bioregionalism, local production, environmentally sustainable production, and so on and so forth. And there is not enough of a policy directive in that direction.
Yeah, just a question on the whole issue of Sri Lanka's agency in this process. What is the type of discourse going on internally within the country on how to respond to this, really horrendous situation? Are we in a situation where the elites just can't save themselves because they've been captured?
Yes.
Right? Or is it there are some bright rays coming through where a new generation is looking at this with new eyes and saying, look, we've got to extricate ourselves from this and looking for solutions. So could you give us a sense for what the discussion is within Sri Lanka?
I wish I could be more positive, because I'm just coming from Sri Lanka. People are feeling very downtrodden, still bewildered by what happened with the regime change. How a regime that was brought to power with a massive mandate was overturned, and what are the forces that led to it. And obviously, you know, there were a number of different forces behind that. And so the population is really divided. There's no unity. And the the politicians, they had maintained their positions, and their interest is in preserving their power. And so there is not much of a resistance, but when you talk to people, there is an understanding of the gravity of the situation. And I think that it is necessary to see this not just as a Sri Lankan issue, but that this is happening around the world. There is massive land grab, resource grab around the world by the dominant interest groups. So that there has to be a coming together of groups across national boundaries to see their common plight. So regional and international networks of support are necessary to see this as a global issue of taking away the rights of people to their own land and resources, and by multiple interest groups. It's very complex.
Thanks very much for your excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it, although I also, as Nick indicated, sobered by what you said with regard to Sri Lanka. And my question does follow on from what Nick asked, and that is, you indicated that you felt that Sri Lanka's future really, from the point of view of the majority population of the country, lay in a non-aligned position which rejected great power rivalry between US and China. And that's certainly, I think, a view that's held by a number of countries in the Indo-Pacific. The Pacific Island states do not see themselves as pawns in a US-China rivalry for dominating the world. But how can this come about? Do you see the efforts, what would have to change in Sri Lankan politics to bring about, if you like, this non-aligned vision? And as you pointed out, in the Cold War, Sri Lanka did have a non-aligned position largely. So how can this come about? Does it have to come from other countries in the Indo-Pacific which share similar views, or does it have to come from particular changes? And what changes would need to happen in Sri Lanka for this vision to be realised?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the unfortunate developments is India's embrace of the quadrilateral alliance and the US position, because India was a leader of the non-aligned movement, especially Nehru was a leader of the non-aligned movement. And instead now India is very much a part of the alliance with the US. And if India were to take a more neutral position in the contest between, say, China and the US, it would be very supportive of smaller countries like Sri Lanka and other southern Asian countries. But so I think it may not come from the governments themselves, but it may have to come from citizen activism and participation of groups of people connecting with each other across national boundaries and really calling for non-alignment rather than letting the IOR, the Indian Ocean region, become even more militarized, because it's already being militarized. There are constant Malabar naval exercises and so on the part of India, the US, and now, as I said, these former Coast Guard cutters have been given to Sri Lanka to go fight the Houthi rebels, etc. So there's got to be, it cannot be just Sri Lanka, which is, people are suffering so terribly, just trying to make ends meet, that there's got to be more regional and international coming together. And even, countries like New Zealand and places, have a lot to contribute in terms of supporting a non-alignment.
Thank you.
So Asuka, thanks so much for your presentation. It was incredibly interesting, and it was really rich and nuanced in terms of your analysis of where Sri Lanka is situated in these international as well as local and regional dynamics. And these dynamics, unfortunately, you see that throughout the global south. So it's great that we're seeing publications that are focused on single case studies, outlining all of these dynamics within a local context. I was interested, and I haven't had a chance to read your book, but I was wondering about the role of the civil war in Sri Lanka in your analysis. Is there a place for that in your discussion of where Sri Lanka is today?
Yeah, the civil war is not over. The military conflict, the armed conflict is over. But the movement for a separate state continues. So it definitely plays into the current dynamics. And I didn't go into some of the details, like this MCC map. This is the projected Sri Lanka physical spatial structure for 2050. And this is issued by the government, but it is said that this was very much a part of the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, part of the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact, although they are denying it. But it shows electrified railway connecting the Trincomalee Harbour on the eastern coast with Colombo, the capital, on the southwest. And there are fears that this could sort of break up the country, because there is also, I've read documents saying that there is an effort to move the population around this highway. 40% of the population is to be moved in the land around this, and that land is to be owned by the US. Now, there's a lot of controversy around this because the US has denied that they have had a part in this, whereas certain nationalist groups are saying, this is what is projected, and whether this is part of making Sri Lanka a military and logistics hub, this massive population transfers and connection of urban commercial hubs. And whether that again is a part of the creating a separate state in the north and the east, all of this is unknown. But with India coming in, that has come to the fore again, because India has a consulate in the north. It's cultivating local Tamil populations. So it's a lot to be seen how it plays out, but the separatist conflict, at least the political conflict, is not over. And that also has been a problem because it divides the population, and it becomes difficult to confront external forces because that becomes part of the divide and conquer strategy.
Excellent, look at that, almost right on time. Thank you very much for coming. And I just need to insert a little bit of local politics into the discussion. We have a politician who's desirous of altering the terms of our original treaty. And one of his aims is in fact this privatisation of iwi-held land. So he wants instead of us iwi being able to have collective ownership of land to turn it into single transferable title. So it is not unique to Sri Lanka. It is occurring here, and I suppose it half-acre Pavlova paradise. So thank you so much. I think we're all somewhat sobered by your presentation, as Lena said, incredibly nuanced, just absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much for travelling this far to the south of the world and joining us. We really do appreciate it.